Welcome to Class 2 for BRITE Old Testament 514, the Prophets. Today we're going to be looking at the late pre-exilic prophets, those prophets that ministered after the fall of Samaria to the Assyrians, leading up to the time that Judah went into exile in Babylon in 586 BC, shortly before and shortly after, so that not only are we looking at the late pre-exilic prophets, we could also say that we're looking at the early exilic prophets, as much of the ministry of Ezekiel and even some of the ministry of Jeremiah took place after the fall of Jerusalem in 586. So again, class 1, we looked at Prolegomena and the early pre-exilic prophets, those that ministered in the northern kingdom prior to the deportation. Now we're going to be focused primarily upon Babylon and the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, and then the early years spent in captivity. What exactly do we mean when we say late pre-exilic books? Well, the exile that we have in mind is the exile of Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah to Babylon. That means that any book that is written prior to 586 BC is pre-exilic, which means that books that are focused on Assyria are called pre-exilic, not because they occur prior to the exile to Assyria, but because they take place prior to the exile to Babylon. They are early pre-exilic books because they take place early in that pre-exilic period. Assyria invades Israel and takes Samaria captive in 721. Nahum writes in 664 to 612, somewhere in that era, focused not on the fall of the northern kingdom, but focused on the fall of Assyria itself in 612 BC. Therefore, he is lumped in with those early pre-exilic prophets, even though he is getting very close to the late pre-exilic era. He's focused on Assyria, which is why I have him in column 1. In the late pre-exilic period, those that are focused on the exile of Jerusalem to Babylon, we have Ezekiel, Jeremiah, the latter chapters of Isaiah, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk. Again, they are all focused on the exile of Jerusalem to Babylon, the end of the southern kingdom. We, of course, have two prophets with unknown dating, Joel and Obadiah, which we'll look at in Lecture 3, and then the three prophets that are written after the exile, after the return of the southern kingdom back to Jerusalem. Daniel, of course, is apocalyptic and ministers during the early exilic period. The pre-exilic prophets, especially those dealing with Babylon, sometimes blur into a exilic period. They're written after 586. For instance, much of Ezekiel takes place after the fall of Jerusalem in 586, after the beginning of the exile. But since a bulk of his book is focused on that deportation, we still often call him a late pre-exilic book, but we could call him an exilic book and still be accurate. Some of Jeremiah as well takes place after the fall of Jerusalem, but his ministry is predominantly before the exile. I should have included the book of Nahum in lecture chapter 1 during the early pre-exilic prophets. However, because of the odd dating of Nahum, I overlooked it and now have to include it here. The city of Samaria fell to the Assyrians in 721 BC. Assyria itself fell in 612 BC, and that is Nahum's focus, not on 721 but on 612. So we know that the book of Nahum was written prior to 612 BC. We also know that Nahum, in chapter 3, verse 8, refers to the town of No Aman. This is generally accepted to be the town of Thebes in Egypt, which fell in 663. So we generally know that Nahum ministered between 663 and 612 BC. It's interesting that Nahum in chapter 1 verse 15 says, "Behold upon the mountains the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace." And this peace, this good news, is the fall of Assyria. It's a question as to who this information is supposed to be comforting to. Assumedly, you would think that it would be comforting to those that Assyria had destroyed. However, Nahum's book does not really go to those that Assyria has destroyed, because those that Assyria destroyed in Samaria are either no longer alive or are in Assyria. It almost appears as though Nahum, although he's focused on Assyria, is trying to encourage the kingdom of Judah, telling them that Assyria has fallen. This would certainly fit well with the period that we see in the book of Isaiah, where Assyria comes, deports the northern kingdom, but also wreaks great destruction on the southern kingdom until God finally puts a stop to it under the kingdom of Hezekiah. In Nahum chapter 2, verse 2, we read, "The Lord is restoring the majesty of Jacob as the majesty of Israel, for plunderers have plundered them and ruined their branches." Again, this would have been a comfort, which indeed is what the word Nahum means, comfort or rest. This would have been a comfort for Judah to know that the Lord is going to restore the majesty of the kingdom. Even though Assyria has destroyed pretty much every town except for Jerusalem, we know that God is going to restore them. And they do reach a time of prosperity after Hezekiah, but again, that prosperity ends when they go into Babylon. But Nahum's focus is not that far into the future. He's still focused on Assyria. In Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 26, we read almost a direct quotation from Nahum chapter 3, verse 5. "Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will lift up your skirts over your face, and I will make nations look at your nakedness and kingdoms at your shame." What's interesting is that Nahum chapter 3, verse 5 is declaring those words to Assyria. But in Jeremiah chapter 13, Jeremiah is declaring those exact same words to Judah. So we get the impression that Nahum, while he's foretelling the fall of Nineveh, foretelling the fall of Assyria in 612 BC, is also indicating to Judah that they should serve God. And when they do not trust in God, do not recognize him as the one that has delivered them from Assyria, Jeremiah condemns them, saying that they will suffer the same fate as the Assyrians. So Nahum is not simply proclaiming the end of a particular nation. Nahum is declaring a message of hope to Jerusalem and calling them to repentance and faith in God accordingly. Sadly, that is not how the southern kingdom responds. The book of Zephaniah is set sometime during the reign of Josiah, who reigned from 641-640 BC, depending on the dating system, to 610-609 BC. We know that the book of Zephaniah is mostly answering the question, why is God delaying in terms of bringing his judgment? Why is the day of the Lord being delayed? However, we have the same question in Zephaniah that we have in Amos. People in Jerusalem are just as guilty of people in the northern kingdom of assuming that the day of the Lord only means judgment on the nations. Zephaniah comes indicating that yes, judgment is going to take place on the nations, but judgment is also going to take place on Judah. The difference is, especially at the end of chapter 3, there will be a restoration of Judah, a restoration of Israel. There's no such promise for the nations. They will be judged, ostensibly permanently. Curiously, in chapter 1, we see the kings and the priests of Judah being called to a sacrifice. However, verses 8 and 9 makes it clear that the kings and the priests themselves are the sacrifices. They are going to be punished for their sin. Again, we see this judgment upon Judah in the midst of these declarations of judgment upon the nations. God is coming. The day of the Lord is coming. There will be no more delay. But it is not going to be a pleasant day. It's going to be a day of judgment on the entire world, the enemies of Judah as well as Judah itself for its own sin. The book does end, though, on that hopeful note. There will be restoration. Zephaniah uses a lot of cliche phrases that are found in other books. He speaks of the phrase, "none to make them afraid." This is found in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 13. It's a phrase that's also found in the book of Leviticus, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Ezekiel. It's a very common phrase, although you'll notice that Leviticus obviously is written during the era of Moses, but Jeremiah and Ezekiel take place in roughly the same time as the book of Zephaniah. The same with the phrase, "not be put to shame," also found in chapter 3, verse 13. You can find that in Isaiah chapter 41 and following, but again, that is a similar era to when Zephaniah is written, as well as the phrase, "my holy mountain," which shows up quite a bit in Ezekiel and Isaiah from chapter 55 onward, so that Zephaniah, while he's using cliche phrases used by other prophets, is using phrases that are applicable to his particular era. The other prophets that are using these phrases are also in the time roughly around Zephaniah. So it's not really surprising that he makes this statement in chapter 3, verse 13. It is a prophecy that is emphasized by a lot of the late pre-exilic prophets. The book of Habakkuk is said to take place during the reign of King Josiah and King Jehoiakim. The inclusion of Jehoiakim extends the possible window for writing from 610-609 BC with the death of Josiah to 598 BC in the death of Jehoiakim. We don't know exactly which sections of the book are written during which era. Perhaps there is more of a time frame, a time gap existing between different sections than it would appear within the book. The question that Habakkuk is dealing with is this fair? Is it fair that Jerusalem appears to be getting away with its sin? To which God responds, no, I'm going to send the Babylonians. Habakkuk then answers, is this fair? Is it fair that the Babylonians, that are more wicked than Judah, are going to be the ones who are going to be the instruments of God's wrath? God assures Habakkuk that he is going to destroy Babylon as well. God gives Habakkuk that great phrase, the righteous shall live by his faith. In other words, indicating that Habakkuk simply needs to trust God, needs to have faith in God, and live by that faith daily. As much as this verse is used by Paul for justification by faith in the New Testament and became a key verse for Martin Luther in the Reformation, the ongoing nature is emphasized here in Habakkuk chapter 2. The righteous shall live by his faith. This fits well with the end of Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 20. The Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him. Habakkuk needs to trust in God and needs to be silent before him, recognizing that God is in his holy temple. Habakkuk does not emphasize theophany as much as some of the other prophets, and yet he still ends with an appearance of God in his holy temple, which really answers the question for Habakkuk of why this is happening. He doesn't get an answer of why, he gets an answer of who. The Lord is the one who is in control, and he needs to trust him accordingly. There is a possible connection between the book of Habakkuk and the book of Job. A recent dissertation has suggested that Habakkuk learns some of the lessons from Job, and there are great similarities between the two books. Job ends with the appearance of God. Habakkuk ends with seeing God in his holy temple. It has been suggested that Habakkuk actually learns some of the lessons of Job, so that when God gives his answer in Habakkuk, Habakkuk is familiar with this type of reasoning and this type of answer, and that having studied the book of Job, being familiar with the story of the book of Job, he is able to grasp what it is that God is telling him and to live accordingly by faith. The prophet Ezekiel was probably deported in one of the early deportations from Jerusalem to Babylon, roughly the year 592 BC. The city of Jerusalem falls in 586 BC, and Ezekiel ministers for another almost 30 years. There is a rough outline of Ezekiel that is chapters 1 through 24, chapter 25 through 32, and then chapter 33 through 48. We're going to look at each of these in more detail. For instance, in chapters 1 through 3, part of that first initial section of chapters 1 through 24, we have the calling and the vision of Ezekiel, as he sees the vision of the wheels upon wheels and the many creatures, as he sees a vision of God himself giving him a calling. Although he's told in chapter 3, verse 6, that he is guaranteed failure, God tells Ezekiel that if I wanted converts, I would have sent you somewhere else, but I sent you to Israel, and they're not going to listen to you. Ezekiel is going to be a prophet, but he's also mute. He is a mute watchman in chapter 3, verse 16 through 27. Eventually, he'll be able to speak freely, but for a while, he's going to be mute and only able to speak when God gives him a prophecy. He's also not able to turn. Ezekiel is probably the prophet, aside from Isaiah perhaps, that does the more bizarre signs. Jeremiah does several parabolic signs, but here the parables that Ezekiel is acting out are quite bizarre. He's mute. He's not able to turn. His wife dies. Several painful experiences that Ezekiel goes through, all foretelling the painful experience that Jerusalem is going to go through. Ezekiel is taken in the spirit to the temple back in Jerusalem prior to its fall, where he sees idolatry, a very shocking idolatry. And because of that shocking idolatry, Ezekiel also sees the glory of God depart from the temple in chapters 9 through 10. In chapter 11, we have the templeless temple, God basically telling the people that he is going to be a temple to them in Babylon, and he is going to give them new hearts. This is one of the first indications in Ezekiel of taking those hearts of stone and giving them hearts of flesh. The false prophet Pelatiah also drops dead. We have more signs and sermons in chapter 12 as Ezekiel is carrying baggage and digging through walls in order to symbolize when Zedekiah tries to go through the wall to escape from the Babylonians. We also have then Ezekiel condemning false prophecy as well as the failed elders of Israel in chapters 12 through 14. even indicating that if Noah, Jonah, and Daniel were present, still God would not spare Jerusalem. Although this last one, Daniel, may actually be Daniel, which was a famous wisdom character throughout Babylonian and Akkadian writings. It may not be Daniel as we know him from the Bible, but a completely different character that shows up in several other stories. The prophet Isaiah spoke of Jerusalem as a vineyard. Ezekiel speaks of Jerusalem as an actual vine in chapters 15, 17, and 19. In chapter 17, there is discussion about an eagle planting a vine and another eagle ripping up the vine, the second eagle being Nebuchadnezzar, who rips up the vine of Israel. Chapter 16 talks about a failed marriage between God and the kingdom of Judah, which is very reminiscent of Hosea chapters 1 through 3 and Hosea's failed marriage to Gomer. Chapter 18 talks about individual sin and individual repentance, that the soul who sins is the one who's going to die, which is quite different from the corporate focus that we typically see in Israel. Chapters 20 through 22 deal with oracles of judgment upon Israel and other nations. Chapter 23 deals specifically with two sisters, referencing the two sisters of Israel and Judah. Judah, however, sees the northern kingdom destroyed, and yet does not change behavior at all. In chapter 24, Ezekiel's wife dies. This is a hard parable for Ezekiel to endure, and he's even told he's not allowed to weep. He's not allowed to mourn. Unfortunately, we don't know if Ezekiel ever gets his wife back. Chapter 26 appears to be unfulfilled prophecy because it speaks of the destruction of the city of Tyre by Nebuchadnezzar. However, we know from archaeology and from other historical records that Nebuchadnezzar only destroyed part of the city of Tyre. The other part, the part that was out in the water as an island, was destroyed later by Alexander the Great, not by Nebuchadnezzar. However, this prophecy isn't really unfulfilled, it's just fulfilled in stages, some of the stages having to do with Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 33, we see a repeat of this theme of watchmen, that Ezekiel is supposed to be a watchman to Israel. He's declaring what is going to happen. Whether or not they believe what he's going to say is their own problem. We also have in chapter 28, we have a prophecy referencing the king of Tyre. It seems, though, as though there's more about Satan than there is about the king of Tyre. Many people have suggested that chapter 28 is actually the destruction and the fall of Satan from heaven. It is difficult to know if that's exactly what is being referenced, but that is a common interpretation. In Jerusalem's fall, in chapter 33, Ezekiel is finally unmuted and he's allowed to say whatever he wants to say, having been muted ostensibly all the way since the time of his call at the beginning of the book. In chapter 36, we begin to have an emphasis upon the coming of the Holy Spirit, which is really reaching its climax in chapter 37 with the dry bones being restored and given new life according to that Spirit, as Ezekiel prophesies to them that they should live. Chapters 38 through 39 talk about Gog and Magog. There's debate over whether or not Gog and Magog are literal or whether or not they are figurative of all the enemies of Israel and God's people. The new temple is talked about in chapters 40 through 42. Again, there is debate over whether or not this is a literal temple, or for those who hold to a premillennial eschatology, whether or not this is the temple, or whether, again, it's all figurative, referring to the church. Either way, the glory returns to the temple in chapter 43, much as it left in chapters 9 and 10, and water of healing for the nations, comes out of the temple in chapter 47, really setting Ezekiel up as the new Moses, as the sacrificial system is reinstated and everything returns to as it was before the exile. Ezekiel has come back, as it were, figuratively, with the people, coming not from the west, from Egypt, but coming from the east, from Assyria and from Babylon, coming back to Jerusalem, reestablishing the temple system, reestablishing the worship of God at the temple. The glory of God takes up its return, takes up its presence in the temple, although we don't know of this ever actually happening. It seems to be just a figurative story, which then leaves the question as to what time frame it's referring to. Is it in the near future? Is it in the distant future? Does it have yet to be fulfilled? It's difficult to know. The book of Jeremiah is difficult to outline because the book does not flow in a coherent linear fashion and because it's not necessarily in chronological order. Generally speaking, the beginning is earlier than the end, but the details in between are not necessarily in a timely order. A rough outline would be chapters 1 through 20, chapter 21 through 36, 37 through 45, 46 through 51, and chapter 52. Jeremiah roughly is found during the time period of 627 BC to 585 BC, and perhaps a little beyond. Jeremiah himself may have written the book, although it's also possible, given chapter 36 and chapter 51, that Baruch is the one who wrote it all down. Chapter 1 is the calling of Jeremiah, commissioning him as a prophet to Israel. He's told that he's going to be persecuted for this position, but that God will indeed strengthen him, and that he will be used by God not only for blessing, but mostly for judgment. Van Gemeren refers to Jeremiah as the new Moses because Jeremiah is applying the book of Deuteronomy to Israel. He's also called the weeping prophet because of his speeches, his soliloquies that he makes in complaint to God. Chapter 8 and 9, chapter 11 and 12, chapter 15, chapter 17, chapter 18, and chapter 20. One of the main speeches that is most famous in Jeremiah is the Valley of Slaughter in chapter 7. This would be the place where the Israelites were going and were offering their sacrifices, most likely to false gods, perhaps even offering up children as sacrifices. It became a place during the exile and the fall of Jerusalem where the bodies in Jerusalem were burned. It became known as the Valley of Gehenna, which is the imagery that God uses in the New Testament to speak of hell. We also have Jeremiah reminding the people that you can't trust in the temple because the tabernacle was at Shiloh and it was still overrun. Jeremiah performs several signs, one of which is buying a loincloth, burying it, and then seeing that it's spoiled, just as Israel has spoiled. Jeremiah is instructed not to pray for Israel. He does. You wonder if then this is considered sin and disobedience for praying when God said not to pray. Jeremiah also interacts quite a bit with lying prophets in chapter 14 and is told in chapter 16 that he needs to stay single and that there is going to be a restoration upon Israel, but first there is going to be a double measure of justice, which is exactly what Isaiah 41 says. Israel has been punished double for all her sins. In chapter 17, Jeremiah addresses the Sabbath and the fact that Israel is not keeping it, and even when they do keep it, it's a burden to them. Chapter 18 talks of the potter and the clay, where the clay spoils as the potter is using it, but the potter is able to make it into something useful anyway, suggesting restoration. In chapter 19, a flask is broken, reminding Israel that they too are broken. Chapter 22 uses signet ring language, which is a reference to the Davidic line of kings. The signet ring here is going to be removed from Israel, but we know from later books, specifically Haggai, that the signet ring will be replaced. In chapter 23, we see the branch. The branch is again the Davidic king. Only in Zechariah, we find out that the branch is not only the Davidic king, but part of the priesthood, which is unexpected. Chapter 24 speaks about good figs and bad figs, using Israel's as an analogy of being good figs and bad figs. Bad figs obviously are thrown out while good figs are eaten. Chapter 25 speaks about the cup of God's wrath lasting 70 years or 70 weeks. This is the passage that the prophet Daniel will read in the future in order to understand how long Israel is actually going to be in exile. Chapter 28 is Hananiah the false prophet, as he opposes Jeremiah with some convenient, comforting words, but is told that he's a false prophet and he will die in exile. Chapter 29 is a lecture to the exiles who already are in Babylon, where Ezekiel, for instance, would be. Jeremiah gets himself in trouble because the people are really hoping that they are going to return quickly from exile, whereas Jeremiah tells them they're going to be there a while, 70 years in fact. 30 through 31 speak about a restoration of Israel, which is why Jeremiah buys a field in chapter 32, investing in the future, as it were. There's going to be a promised return, and not only a promised return, but also a promised change of heart. There's going to be a new covenant that is going to be written on people's hearts, a spiritual transformation that's going to take place, a spiritual restoration, in addition to restoring them to the promised land. Chapter 34 is a prophecy against Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, for his wickedness, promising that he will have his children killed in front of him, then his eyes put out. Chapter 35 is the exact opposite. It is a praise for the Rechabites, because they continue to follow the guidelines of their ancestor in not drinking alcohol, although God questions why they're able to follow the words of their ancestor, but Israel will not follow the words of their ancestor Moses. In chapter 36, the scroll that Jeremiah has been writing to the king is burned by the king in his winter palace, but Jeremiah rewrites the whole thing. Jeremiah is famously thrown into the cistern in chapter 38 and sinks down in the mud until he's rescued. And in chapter 39, Jerusalem finally falls. Nebuchadnezzar is pretty chill about it, though, and tells Jeremiah he can go wherever he wants, as though God had told Nebuchadnezzar both to sack the town and also to care for Jeremiah. Jeremiah does warn those who are left in Jerusalem, though, after the deportation to Babylon, not to go to Egypt, that Egypt too will fall. But they don't listen, and they apparently take Jeremiah with them, and Jeremiah likely dies there in Egypt. Chapter 45 is a blessing for Baruch because he has helped Jeremiah. 46 through 51 are a prophecy against the various nations that surround Judah, and then the events of the entire book are recapped in chapter 52, giving us a sort of end note to the whole book.